Hello, everybody. It's good to see everyone at our Zoom call yesterday. Um, awesome to see everybody, and it was great to interact. Those of you who have not gone to and done the Zoom call, you will be doing that today during our class period, so make sure you check it out. Okay, so we're going over today is section 3 of chapter 1, and it's all about research. So you'll have this and just a little quiz today, and then you'll have a little bit more tomorrow. I'm going to post that as soon as I can so you can work on work ahead if you like. Okay, so section 3, and this particular section is probably one of the most important that you're going to be learning about, and that's about research and research methods. Where this comes up is in certain questions on the exam, but also on the FRQ. There's usually an FRQ that's solely about research, and then it may throw in some vocabulary, and you have to analyze the vocabulary against the research, but they'll ask you, what's the independent variable? Is this a valid study? And you have to evaluate that. So paying attention to this is really, really important so that you understand research and so forth. Okay, in the chapter, it talks about the goals of research. So again, just like the goals of psychology, describe, explain, predict, and control. But also in there, we have the ideas that in research that events are lawful and they follow a pattern. And that makes sense because when we replicate a study, it should have a pattern. It should have a similar result every single time you do that if the study is valid and the data and conclusions are. And in addition to that, through especially experiments, behaviors, and mental processes have causes and they are explainable. And so we use research to create that explanation, and that always when we do research, we want to keep an open mind and so forth. Psychology, just like history, is an evolving animal, and there could always be alternatives and different variables that could also have caused those conclusions to happen. So we always need to be open-minded and skeptical about research. So they went over the scientific method. This is a pretty easy chapter. The test, usually everybody does really well on the test because it's all review. There's just a few things in there that are psychology based instead of just the regular experiments. So again, if you are a psychologist and you want to find out and you have a question about something, you're going to do research, and that research is going to lead you to a direct hypothesis. And then through that hypothesis, you're going to decide what kind of experimental design you want to do, what's appropriate for your question. And you may have variables included in that. You may have to operationally define something if it's an experiment so that it can be replicated properly. You're going to collect your data, and you're going to think about any kind of biases and controls for that. You're going to think about ethical considerations. With psychology, we're not just doing tests on metals and using chemicals and things like that. We are doing tests on animals and human beings. If we're doing that, we can't just have any kind of study. I can't do a study showing the effects of peer pressure on kids drinking alcohol. That would not be legal or considered ethical. I'd have to find some other way to find that out, like doing a survey on whether or not somebody drank alcohol because their friends did. So you have to be really cognizant of that and ethical considerations. You're going to then do analyzing data and conclusions and reporting findings just like you normally would in a study. There are two types of research methods, and they're in terms of categories. One is descriptive, which is not experimental, and then there's experimental. So descriptive are methods that observe and describe behavior. These could be things like, obviously, a natural observation is going to be observing behavior, but like a survey could do a what or a where. Interviews are going to do that. Questionnaires are going to do that. Experiments are going to show variables, causes, and change in the second variable. And experimental is the only avenue where you can actually prove causation. Not even a correlational study can you do that. So for instance, a social psychologist studying the effects of group pressure is likely to conduct an experiment, manipulating a type of peer pressure and seeing its effects. You could do something like the use of social media, of peer pressure to do homework, or do an assignment. That could be easily put in an experiment to show causation. A psychologist who's interested in personality might do an intensive case study because experiment is not something they're looking for. They're looking to see, for instance, what kind of people, what kind of personalities buy more organic goods. And then you look at and do intense case studies on a few people to see who actually buys organic goods and why they're doing that, and if they come from a certain socioeconomic class, a certain educational level, how much money they, how much money they make, maybe even like their political party, like any of that kind of stuff could happen. Okay. All right, in terms of research methods, we have two also in terms of research, either method in terms of what we're looking for data, either quantitative or qualitative. Quantitative is anything that's definitely objective and has numbers usually associated with it. So you see the word quantity. Quality is where we have this descriptive reports. An interview is going to have more anecdotal, so like a natural observation. So studies that use numbers, they would be experiments, correlational studies, because you have scatter plots, and you also have surveys, because they have percentages of people who answered a question. For qualitative, you're looking at more things like interview, a natural observation, or a case study. A case study is taking, if I'm looking at a child and I'm going to, study that unique child, I'm going to look at their interviews from their family, their teachers, their standardized test scores. Now I know that sounds like a number, but it's more of like a holistic, it's not the only thing they're using. I would look at their grades, I would interview them to see what they say about themselves. So that's going to be more of those descriptive reports. Okay, what ways can we ensure that there's validity in a research and then be able to apply that to a larger population? Okay. So we could be thinking about picking a research method that fits the question. You definitely want to have one that's going to generate the proper data. If you're looking for cause and effect, you're not going to use anything else but an experiment. Otherwise, you can't do that and it can't be valid. You can't say that it's cause or effect. So you're going to definitely, the research method is something to look at. Also sampling. I know you know this from other classes and from science. Using a random sample or even a stratified sample. So picking out of a hat, you have a bunch of people in the room, you're just picking 10 and you pick 10 random people. It is okay to do a stratified sample though if you want to have gender. So if I have a 30-person class and I want 5 girls and 5 boys, I'm going to put all the girls in one group and all the boys in another group, and then I'm going to randomly pick out 5. Okay, I can do that for any kind of category, age, social class, and etc. I want to control for biases to help with that as well. So biases from the experimenter, biases from the participants. For instance, for a survey, I don't want to answer a certain question that they definitely have to answer yes, because it's going to prove my hypothesis. So you have to be careful of controlling for that. I also want to be able to examine and make sure the relationship of a correlation or correlation between two variables is true. That would create validity. So if I have a correlation that's only a correlation coefficient that's only 0.50, that's like half. That is not a good relationship. If it's closer to 1, like 0.88, that would be a good relationship between two things, and that would be more valid. So our data, our percentages and our numbers need to be there. Our replication of the study is going to make things more valid because it's going to be done over and over. And one of the things we need to limit, and you may want to write this down, I do not think this is in your book. So trying to limit the Hawthorne effect. The Hawthorne effect would be in controlling for biases. And that's going to have an effect on data because people change their behavior because they know they're a part of a study and they know they're being observed. So let's take, for instance, somebody is being asked a question in an interview and they think the other person is really attractive and they don't want to say anything that wouldn't be socially acceptable or that person may look at them in an ill light. So they're going to change their answer that they would actually say because they don't want to look bad in front of somebody else. So that's something we try to avoid and try to have account for when you're looking for bias. So it's examples of samples and what we should do with samples. These are really important because if you're looking and evaluating a research study, you need to have that idea of what a good sample might look like. So for instance, if a psychologist is looking at how tall American men are and they live in a city that's disproportionately has more basketball players that are close to 7 feet tall, that's not going to represent the real or the American public. So we have to account for that. Are they outliers and so forth? A random sample, it doesn't have to be arbitrary like pulling out of a hat. If I want to study all the kids in Carmel Clay schools, I could take every 20th kid on the enrollment list and do it that way. I could do every 20th kid in first grade, second grade, and third grade to account for age. Okay, so that would be a stratified sample. A psychologist could look at gender, every 20th girl, a variety of ages, classes, neighborhoods, and so forth. And one of the things that you can do that makes it very specific to be able to go nationwide with your data is if 30% of school children of 8 are between 5 and 8, then there has to be 30% of school children in 5 and 8 in your study on the local level, wherever you're doing in your sample. So that's a good way of keeping it so that it's equivalent with the national average. In terms of randomization, let's look at this example of randomization. So a doctoral student recently attempted to evaluate a new math instructional approach. So she knows that there's some kind of issue. She's an educational psychologist. She knows there's some kind of issue in schools with kids learning math. And so she's going to assign the treatment or this new developmental program to one class and then have the other class do the traditional approach of learning math. And then the students are going to be able to freely select what class or program they want to take, which sounds really nice. But is that randomization? That is not randomization. They're able to choose. They aren't randomly being put in there. And what we need to look at is the kids are going to choose a program that makes them feel more comfortable. So let's take this scenario. If kids are really good in math, they might want to take the new approach because it's kind of cool, it's kind of different. They don't love the old way because it's easy and they want to be challenged. So they're going to go in that group. And then the traditional kids may have a bunch of varying levels. Some kids that just don't want to try something new, or some kids that really struggle. So what ends up happening is the result of the study is the really strong students are going to make that math program look even better than it should be. And then what happens after that? If they replicate the study over and over and over again, then that math program starts being employed in Carmel Clay schools. Everybody thinks it's going to help kids even more do better in math, and so they give it to the kids that don't do really well in math, and then we find out it actually doesn't work because they all failed I-STEP, and then they have to go retake it, and that's time, money, etc., etc. So it's really important to look at how you're doing sampling. Also with sampling, we have to account for ethnic groups. If we look even at the amount of ethnic groups that are in the United States, some are born in the United States, others are foreign born, and how can this affect research? Well, everybody has different experiences. Even the time that people spend in America can have that. If somebody just moved here, they're not going to be able to respond to certain things about America versus somebody who's had an extended stay, even if they're foreign born. They all bring different cultural norms and things to the table, so they have to be recognized in the same. And if we look at even how things are distributed in America itself, 58% of Hispanics live in 10 cities. So if we're sampling from that city and we're doing random sampling, we may get a higher percentage of Hispanics, which may mean something for our data and for our answers, depending on what we're doing. 48% of Asians live in just Los Angeles, New York City, and San Francisco, so you have to account for that. Black populations in the northern urban centers, based on the Great Migration that happened a long time ago in the 1920s, and we have to look at southern cities too, what the population would be there. White populations currently are growing in Texas and in California, so if you're doing any kind of study there, you have to account for that. And if we look, 24% of counties in the United States are below the national average, have white populations below the national average. And over half of the counties had at least 90% white people. So when we talk about that, and depending on the study that we're doing, we really have to account for that, because what's going to end up happening is a representative sample may not be true. It may be really one ethnic group or the other ethnic group, or highly disproportional and so forth. Okay? And then why are we going to operationally define your question that you were given for section 3 on the idea of evil? So what you should have kind of put down for this is that if we are looking at the example of evil, it's very ambiguous, and it's very subjective what people say about a variable. Okay, so we have to have a measurement. If we're going to replicate this, it has to have a measurement on what you were thinking of what it was. So an example of this would be if I'm going to measure motivation. Motivation can be a motivation for anything. And I'm going to use a 5-point scale in order to measure, and I picked the completion of homework. So completion of homework is a specific thing I'm looking for with motivation. I can put like 5 different things if I want, but I'm going to use a 5-point scale so that the numbers will be comparable between replicated studies. And you want to put in your notes, any kind of scale that you use is appropriate for an operational definition, and then you have to be really specific about what it's measuring, okay? So for evil, the conversations we've had in class, since you guys have not had the opportunity to do that, is we talked about, like, okay, what would be evil? And so some people said murder, some people said rape, some people said abuse, lying, you know, it all kind of varies, and we could have all that. And it will depend on what your lens of evil is, right? So for me, one thing you guys don't know about me is my first inclination of what evil is murder. And that's because my uncle was murdered when I was in middle school. He was stabbed in the heart with a knife by another individual. And so I have a really big lens about what evil is because of that. Some people may automatically pick abuse or rape because that is their experience. So all of that has to be operationally defined. Even if it's ambiguous, we can still measure it. Okay, analyzing data and drawing conclusions. What do we need to do with that? So if I do replicate and it's not by chance, then I can do other things with it. In your book, it talked about meta-analysis. I can create a really large study then. So these smaller studies can lead to larger studies, and then hopefully developing theories over time. And these are important to have that data be very clear and very accurate. This is an example of a researcher from Vermont who admitted to fraud. He fraudulently put out the data, and he wanted to do some research on obesity, and he fabricated that data to win a grant. And if you are doing that and then your study is going out there, if it's obesity and metabolism, the effects of that could be dramatic. Somebody could be changing their diet and their life based on the data that somebody's put out there. So it's really important to make sure that data is correct. Okay, so we're going to be getting into, this section actually talks about descriptive methods. And so one of the things we're going to be doing is looking at all the descriptive methods. And one in particular that I wanted to point out was naturalistic observation. Okay, and with naturalistic observation, the other ones being case study, interview, questionnaire, etc. And one thing with naturalistic observation that I wanted to point out is 2 in particular words, and that's intrusive and extrusive research. And so when we look at an example like this, you'll see the movie Gorillas in the Mist with Sigourney Weaver there, but then you see the real lady up there, Fosse, who did a famous study, which was originally then called Gorillas in the Mist. She did a 13-year study where she lived with gorillas, which you can see that's pretty dangerous, but they accepted her into her group, and it took her a while for them to do that, but then she was able to observe them and so forth. So there's a little video for you to watch and how she was using anecdotal notes to describe what was going on with the gorillas at the time. And you can see most of what you're going to see is intrinsic, that she is has a presence. She's with the gorillas. She's not extrusive, which is where she'd be hiding in a bush watching them from afar. And they both have some good positives and negatives for that. With intrusive, it's more accurate because you're involved and you're right there and you can see, and you're not like hiding behind something and maybe you miss something. But the presence of you, because you're not there in their natural environment, can change that outcome, and you'll see that with her when the gorillas are doing certain things. And then extrusive is less biased because obviously you're not impeding and you're not involved in their world. But you could be too far removed that observation could be inaccurate. Okay? So what you guys are going to be doing with this is you are going to be, and you can do this today, or if you would like a little break after doing your short little quiz for section 3, if you want to do this tomorrow, I'm going to put it on tomorrow's module, and you can do that and read section 3 or section 4 and the rest of the chapter. Or you can go into the next module and you can go ahead and do this advertisement if you'd like in the next virtual module for tomorrow. Okay. And so what we're going to do with kind of summing up section 3 is be looking at what are some advantages and disadvantages of these 5 different advertisements. And what you're going to do is there's a little video to watch that talks about some advantages and disadvantages of different ones. You can look up words or look up information about those as well. And you're going to design your own advertisement for that. Okay. So the advertisement could have, as you can see, there's a picture at the top there. It could be an advertisement with just some words and pictures, and it has, you know, these advantages, you know, buy this because it's great for, you know, good validity of research, you know, whatever you want to do to be creative. You guys, there's a lot of artists in our group, so I'm sure that you guys can design something for that. Okay, those of you who are painters out there, you can even draw something if you'd like, and then submit that. You can do it by hand or you can do it digitally. It's totally fine. And I know we have some digital artists out there too. Okay. The other thing is that you can also, or option, and Emily, our Broadway star, may like this too, is to do a recording, okay, and that would be on the Canvas recorder, and then you guys just pretend like you're doing a TV ad or a radio ad, and you do it that way, so you don't have to do anything like, you know, physical with it as well, okay? But do the research first, advantages, disadvantages of using your chosen one out of those 5 that you see there. You can choose which one you want to do, and then just do the advantages and disadvantages. You can negatively advertise against another one, so if you're doing survey, you can say case study doesn't work as well, and so forth. Okay, so have fun with that. All right, guys, we'll see you tomorrow. Bye.